Hi, my name is Brenton Harrison, and we're here today for part 2 in our series on equity-based compensation. In part 1, we covered a type of benefit called restricted stock units, or RSUs. And today, in part 2, we're covering something called stock options. Let's get started. I definitely hope that you tuned into part 1 of our series on equity-based compensation, which is when a company gives you pay in the form of company equity rather than cash, because in that video about restricted stock units, we covered a lot of key terms that will be very relevant in today's lesson about stock options. So if you haven't already, I definitely encourage you to go ahead and check that out. And in talking about equity-based compensation, one of the things that I said we would do is group them into 2 different camps. There would be the first camp of will be yours benefits. And for will be yours benefits, you simply have to wait a certain period of time as laid out in your vesting schedule in order for those benefits to be yours. But at some point, if you follow those terms, they will be yours. The second group are could be yours benefits. They have many of the same features. They require you to wait a certain period of time. There are a number of other requirements as well in order for you to experience these benefits, but also the added decision of you actually purchasing that benefit. You have to say, not only have I met these requirements, but I'm going to dig into my pocket and pay for this benefit that could be mine if I make that choice. Stock options are a could be yours benefit because the basic premise of a stock option is a company offers their employee the option to buy a certain number of shares of company stock at a predetermined price if they decide to dig into their pocket and pay for those shares. Before we get into the ins and outs of stock options, let's dial it back a little bit to give you a grand summary of RSUs. When we talked about these RSUs or restricted stock units, one of the things that I said is that you often see these offered to executives at big corporations or new hires at these corporations or VP level employees as a part of their annual compensation package. So it's not something that's often offered to rank and file employees. Why is this the case? It's because RSUs have immediate value. If the employee in question stays at that company for long enough to meet the requirements laid out in the vesting schedule, they will be granted those shares. And because that company is likely public, those shares have a monetary value out in the marketplace. So it's an expensive benefit for a company to offer. Thus, they only offer it to a certain class of employees. When you think about it, when an RSU actually vests and now comes under the control of that employee, they've essentially been given a bonus. It's just instead of a cash bonus, the bonus comes in the form of company stock. Conversely, stock options can be offered to employees of all levels and companies of all types. It could be offered by a public corporation that hopes to explode in growth one day, but it could also be offered by a private company who hopes to one day go public, even if that day is far, far in the future. So why are these benefits so valuable to the employee, but so cost effective to the company offering these stock options? Well, it all has to do with the ability to purchase that company's stock at a potentially discounted price. Here are some key terms to know regarding stock options, some of which you've already learned in part 1. First, we have vesting schedule, and the vesting schedule is the terms regarding the length of time that the employee must be at that company in order to exercise that option. And in the example, we have an executive who's granted the option of buying 1,000 shares of company stock over a 4-year period, which would mean that 250 options vest each year. Next, we have the grant date, and the grant date is the date on the calendar that the company grants the employee the option to buy that stock. An example would be if an executive is granted an option to buy those 1,000 shares on January 1st, 2022 at an exercise price of $5 per share. So let's see what an exercise price is. Exercise price is the price the employee actually pays for those shares when they exercise them. You'll also see this referenced as strike price. Now, we've used the term exercise. Let's put it in an example and make it a verb so you understand when we reference this later in the video what we mean. Exercising an option simply means that an employee has exercised their right to purchase the shares. They have made the decision to do so. In our example, the executive with the options granted on January 1st, 2022 exercises their rights and buys those shares on July 1st, 2022. Next, we have market value at exercise. And market value at exercise is the fair market value of the stock price at the date an option is exercised. These terms are really important to keep up with because when we get to the taxation of stock options, this will all come together. So in our example, at the date of exercise, the fair market value of the company stock is $20 per share. Next is discount element. And discount element is the difference between the fair market value of the stock when you exercise your option and buy those shares and the actual price the employee paid. Remember, you have the exercise price or the strike price. That's the price that the employee pays when they buy these shares of stock. But that could be different than the market value of the stock when they buy it. So the discount element is the difference between those two numbers. For example, if you have stock with a fair market value of $20 per share and an exercise price of $5, the discount element is simply the difference between those two, $15. $20 market value at exercise minus the $5 exercise or strike price the employee actually paid. Next, we have the offering period, and the offering period is the length of time the employee will be able to actually exercise that option before these options expire. You'll see 10 years listed here frequently. So in our example, the executive's option to buy 1,000 shares expires within 10 years. And lastly, we have AMT or alternative minimum tax. And we're going to leave a pin in this for now because if you don't make an extremely high amount of money, this isn't going to be as relevant to you. So you can just ignore this for now, but we're going to mention it later in this video. Now that you know the key terms associated with employee stock options, which can also be abbreviated as ESOs, we can dig into the differences between the two main types that are available to employees. You have ISOs or incentive stock options. These are also known as statutory or qualified options. And then the second category is non-qualified stock options. And as a reminder, simply go back and look at those key terms as we get into this terminology if you need a refresher that'll help drive these points home. Incentive stock options or ISOs are the most preferable form of stock option because of their preferential tax treatment. So this is definitely a highbrow benefit you typically see offered to an executive at either a public company or a private company that's hoping to go public someday in the future. With incentive stock options, those who meet certain tax requirements can purchase these shares, which means that they are exercising their option to purchase them at a set date and time, which is their exercise date, for a predetermined price, which is their exercise price or their strike price. And if they do so while meeting certain requirements, they can do all of this without seeing any immediate taxation for the difference between the value of the stock on the day that they purchased it and the price that they actually paid for it, which is the discount element. So summarizing all of that, if you have incentive stock options and you meet the requirements needed to do so, you can buy these shares or exercise your option without having any immediate tax implications from the discount you received when you purchased those shares. We have an employee granted incentive stock options to purchase 1,000 shares of company stock, and they decide that they're going to exercise that option and purchase all 1,000 shares at a price of $5 per share. This is their exercise price, also known as the strike price. Now, the date that they purchased it, which is the exercise date, the fair market value of that company stock was $20 per share. So they have stock valued at $20,000 that they only purchased for $5,000. This means that the discount element is $15 per share. They have a $15,000 benefit that they experienced, but because they met the requirements needed for an incentive stock option, there is no immediate income tax due on this $15,000 discount element that they received. Now you see this little asterisk at the bottom. This is because there is an alternative minimum tax adjustment or an AMT adjustment for this discount element, which we're going to get into right now. Here's the quickest way that I can explain alternative minimum tax without us getting too deep into the weeds for people who may not even be affected by alternative minimum tax. The best way to describe it is there's maybe more than two, but there are at least two different tax codes. You have your ordinary tax code, which everyone is subject to, and then you have an alternative minimum tax. Now, the alternative minimum tax basically exists because there are people out there who make an insane amount of money company and have tax professionals who are so good that they've learned how to structure the money that they make in a way that it avoids paying any significant level of taxes under the ordinary tax bracket. Just by experience or expertise, even though they're earning crazy money, they're paying less tax than you and I, who might be making a much smaller amount of money. The alternative minimum tax was created to make sure that those people don't get away with it. As a matter of fact, alternative minimum tax tells you what it is. If they look at their taxes they would have owed under the regular tax code and it does not meet at least a minimum amount that the IRS thinks is appropriate, then the IRS is going to say, no, we're going to run your taxes and your income through another tax code called the alternative minimum tax code. And they're going to calculate what you would owe under both codes, and whatever is the higher number, that's what the employee would have to pay. Think about it this way. If you make $1 million a year and your CPA finds a way for you to owe $0 under the ordinary tax code, and then they calculate those same taxes under the alternative minimum tax and you owe $100,000 under that version, you would be subjected to that version and you would owe $100,000 in tax under the alternative minimum tax code. Now, in 2022, if you're an individual, you have to be earning over $500,000 a year. And if you're a couple, over $1 million a year before you're subjected to that alternative minimum tax code. So that's what I mean. I don't want to spend a ton of time on this because there are so few people out there who are subjected to it. All you need to know for this conversation is if you are one of those people where you're earning over $500,000 a year as a single person, over $1 million a year as a couple, and you also have stock options, you really are in a situation where you likely need advanced tax help and also the help of a financial advisor. So as we discussed stock options, we said that discount element, the difference between what someone actually pays for their stock when they exercise that option and the fair market value of that stock, they do not owe any taxes in terms of income taxes on it when they exercise the option for an incentive stock option. But there is, if you're subjected to alternative minimum tax, an AMT adjustment for that discount element. I'll show you in graphical form what that looks like. But again, this affects so few people. I don't want this to be something that derails you as we try to drive these points home. Next, we have non-qualified stock options. And non-qualified stock options are also referred to as non-statutory options. While incentive stock options are typically offered to executives or really high income earners or founders, non-qualified or non-statutory stock options are typically the type that you would see granted to employees at all levels of an organization. The janitor at the organization could have the same offering in terms of how they accumulate these options as the executive, which is not something that you would typically see in an incentive stock option. So incentive stock option, that's for the highbrow. Non-qualified stock option is for the everyday Joe out there just hoping that that company goes public someday. Unlike when you exercise an incentive stock option and you don't have any immediate tax impact from the difference between the fair market value of the stock and the price you actually paid for it, the discount element, with non-qualified stock options, there actually is an immediate tax impact for this discount element. Let's go back to our original example where we had the employee who had the option to buy 1,000 shares of company stock. The first option we used was for an incentive stock option, but let's just use these same details for a non-qualified stock option. So they had the option to buy 1,000 shares of company stock and they decided to exercise it at $5 per share. So it was $5,000 that they spent on it, but per share it cost them $5. And on that day that they exercised their option, the fair market value of that company stock was $20,000 of value. It was $20 per share times the 1,000 shares that they purchased. So this means that the discount element, the difference between these two, was $15 per share or $15,000 in total for the 1,000 shares that they exercised. And even though they did not receive this money in cash, their tax return for the year will reflect this $15,000 discount element as if it were earned income. They will pay income taxes on it in the year that they exercise this non-qualified stock option. And now that you understand the impact of purchasing each form of employee stock option, let's now get to the implications of selling these shares, which is called a disposition. Because ISOs have such favorable tax treatment, you have to be really careful when you exercise the options and when you sell any potential shares. Because if certain requirements aren't met, when you sell stock that you purchased through an ISO, it could lead to what's called a disqualifying disposition, which essentially strips the incentive stock option of some of its tax benefits. So what you're looking here is going back to our original example where we had an employee who exercised their option to buy 1,000 shares of company stock with a fair market value of $20 per share and an exercise price of $5 per share for a $15 discount element. We covered that with the ISO, with the incentive stock option, there is no immediate taxation for that discount element. There is an alternative minimum tax adjustment, but they do not owe any income taxes under the ordinary income code under incentive stock options just from the exercise. Now let's assume that years later, the employee decides to sell those shares when the fair market value is $100. So that means that the 1,000 shares they originally purchased for $5,000 are now worth $100,000. So when they sell, that's a $95,000 profit. Now, in a qualifying disposition of shares, when they purchase them using ISOs, that entire $95,000 would be treated as a long-term capital gain. And we covered that in our post on restricted stock units. But a long-term capital gain essentially means that they would pay taxes on the profit of either 15% or 20%. For ISOs with a qualifying disposition, there will also be a negative alternative minimum tax adjustment for the same amount that was added to alternative minimum tax at exercise. So again, rather than going deep into alternative minimum tax for something that may not be relevant to you, the overarching points of an incentive stock option qualifying disposition are these. When you exercise the stock, there is no ordinary income for the discount element. And if you hold it for a certain period of time and you then later sell the stock for a profit, you would pay either a long-term capital gain of 15% or 20% of the difference between what you sold it for and the actual exercise price you paid at the exercise date. In order for a disposition of ISOs to be qualified, you have to sell them a minimum of 2 years after the options were granted to you and 1 year after you exercised your right to purchase the shares. Now, if you're listening to that and you hear, okay, 2 years from the grant date, 1 year from the exercise date, that means I have to wait 3 years before I can sell these shares and get a favorable tax benefit. That's actually not accurate. I'm going to show you a couple examples that will show you how you can actually do both within a 2-year period, depending on when you exercise those shares. But those are the rules: 2 years from grant, 1 year from exercise. Now, there is another requirement that we're not going to get into details for, but like you at least need to know it exists. And that is that you have to be an employee of the organization at the time that the options were granted to you. And you had to have been employed or currently employed by that organization within 90 days of the date that those options were exercised. Let's look at two examples that both meet the time requirements for a qualifying disposition. On the left, you have an employee who had shares granted on January 1st, 2022, and they exercised the option the same day that they were granted. So they were granted the option, they turn around that same day and they purchase the shares. And then they sell those shares 2 years later on January 2nd, 2024. Now, if you're thinking about this simultaneously meets both requirements. They sold it 2 years from the date of grant. They sold on January 2nd, 2024. It was granted to them on January 1st, 2022, but it was 1 year from the exercise date. So technically it was more than 1 year from the exercise date because they did both on the same day. But if you're tracking the calendar, this simultaneously meets the goal of 2 years from grant, 1 year from exercise, all within a 2-year period. Conversely, we have an employee who was granted their shares same day, January 1st, 2022, but they waited 2 years to exercise that option. So they didn't exercise them until January 2nd, 2024. This would mean that they would have to wait until January of 2025 before they can meet both requirements, 2 years from grant, 1 year from exercise. So it would take them 3 years total before they could receive the preferential tax treatment of a qualifying disposition. If you have a disqualifying disposition, then the discount element you receive for the incentive stock option would simply be taxable to you as ordinary income. And any difference between the sale price of the stock and the fair market value at exercise would either be a short-term or a long-term capital gain based on the length of time the exercised shares were held. You can see from our chart that because this is a disqualifying disposition, that difference between the $20 fair market value at exercise and the $5 exercise price is now taxable as ordinary income, kind of similar to a non-qualified stock option. And the difference between the $100 per share sale price and the $20 fair market value at exercise would be either a long-term or a short-term capital gain. Using the same example, let's look at what it would mean to have a disposition of non-qualified stock options. So in our example, our employee sells their 1,000 shares at $100 per share, but for NSOs, they have already paid income taxes on that discount element that they benefit from in buying those shares for $5,000 when they were valued at $20. So because of this fact, that remaining $80,000 of profit, the $100,000 that they sold it for, and the $20,000 fair market value of the stock at exercise, this would be treated as a long-term capital gain if the stock has been held after exercise for more than 1 year. Now, if it was held for less than 1 year, this amount would simply be a short-term capital gain. If you have options that have vested, meaning you can now purchase those shares if you choose to, at a company that's been acquired by another organization, you'll typically see them do one of a few things. The first is they could give you cash for those options. The second could be that they could replace options for that old company stock with options for the new company stock. And then lastly, if those shares or the options are underwater, and what that means is that the fair market value of that stock is actually less than the exercise price you would have to pay to buy the shares, they would simply cancel those options. Even if your company never goes public, you do see examples of private companies who will give their employees the right to sell back their options to the organization. And in this scenario, that would mean that even though they never went public, there is a monetary value to those options. Incentive stock options expire if they're not exercised within 10 years of the grant date. Non-qualified stock options have a little more flexibility. 10 years is still pretty standard, but they can vest or they can expire in a shorter period of time if the company so chooses. Any options that you don't exercise within 90 days of leaving a company, those are unfortunately going to be forfeited. We've been using a really basic example for these options of an exercise price of $5 per share. But when you start getting into these really big, really valuable companies, their share prices could already be pretty high. And there are definitely scenarios where you could desperately want to participate and buy the shares available to you with that option, but not have the cash to be able to do so. Fortunately for you, employees in this situation can still find a way to participate through something that's called a cashless exercise. A cashless exercise occurs when you don't have the money needed to buy the shares available to you in an option, so you go and find a lender that will grant you a short-term loan. You use the proceeds of that loan to turn around and buy the shares of company stock through the option, and then you turn around and immediately sell those shares so that you can pay back the lender who gave you the money and pocket the difference as your profit. Now, we covered in this video for incentive stock options that you need to hold your shares at least 2 years from grant date and 1 year from exercise to get favorable tax treatment. And we also covered with non-qualified stock options that even with those, you need to wait at least a year after exercise to sell those shares and get a long-term capital gain. But in this scenario, for a cashless exercise, you are immediately selling shares after you've exercised them. And that means that you now have either a disqualifying disposition for an ISO, or you have an NSO that you've sold before you would experience a long-term capital gain. So if you do this, you're going to be subjected to the harshest tax penalties that you could possibly have under the stock option requirements. But there are still scenarios where, based on the level of profit involved, this could be worth doing. Let's look at an example of an employee who needs to find the money to take advantage of a non-qualified stock option to buy 1,000 shares of company stock at an exercise price of $100 per share. So they have those shares available at $100 per share. That's $100,000 that they are worth in terms of their purchase price. The current share price is $400 per share for a $400,000 fair market value. Now, this is not meant to take to the bank, but we're just doing some estimating. We're going to assume that the taxes they would owe if they immediately sold these shares was $120,000. So what this company and this employee does, is they go and they secure a loan for $220,000. The $100,000 that they would need to buy the actual shares and the $120,000 in taxes that are a result of selling those shares immediately. They then exercise that option. So they get the shares, they immediately sell those shares, and they repay the loan. And when they do this, they have a $180,000 net profit. $400,000 that they got to sell the shares of stock, and then the $220,000 they had to pay back left them with this $180,000 net profit. Stock options are a really cool benefit to have, but they are complex. You definitely need someone on your side who can help you understand the tax implications of buying them, selling them, how they fit in the rest of your portfolio. And with all these things, when we talk equity-based compensation, you're now playing in waters that require just someone there to hold your hand in case you get a little too deep into the deep end. So I would encourage you, if these are the things that are now in front of you as a part of your compensation packages, to either take the time to learn about them on your own or seek wise counsel. But I do hope that this video was helpful in helping you understand the ins and outs, at least in terms of the basic terminology as it pertains to stock options. Like I said, part 1, we cover restricted stock units. Part 2, we're covering stock options. We are building upon these knowledge bases. And in part 3, we're going to talk about a type of equity compensation called an employee stock purchase plan. So I hope you'll tune into that video. If you haven't subscribed, please do so and subscribe to the notifications so you can see when new content is posted, and we'll keep bringing that content to you as frequently as we can. Have a good one.